Hi, I'm Izzy. Welcome to Hebrew Sketches, Big Ideas on a Napkin. Someone once said that reading a translation is like a man trying to kiss his bride through her veil. I don't actually agree with that though. I think reading a translation is more like a man trying to kiss his bride through a brick wall. There's something in between them, a big something. They are one layer removed from each other. They just can't come in that first-hand contact. And that's what it's like reading a translation of anything, whether you are reading a translation of the Holy Scriptures or whether you're reading a translation of any other kind of literature. But I think that this problem is especially true when you are reading a translation of the Holy Scriptures from Hebrew, the original language, into English or some other language. And there are three reasons why I think this. Firstly, every Hebrew word belongs to a family of related words. So a Hebrew word isn't just a standalone object with its own independent meaning. Every Hebrew word is related to a bunch of words that have similar but slightly different meanings. And if you take that Hebrew word out of the context of its related words, you're going to miss most of that. It's actually somewhat similar to human beings. You have a family. It may be the family that you grew up with, your birth family, or it may be the family that you started with your spouse, your children. Either way, if I look at you as an individual, I'll get to know you on a certain level. I'll see some things about you. But if I look at you in the context of your family, whether it be the people that you grew up with or your spouse and children, I'll get a much bigger view of you. I'll get to know you so much better. We often use the word family resemblance for this. Let's say with the people you grew up with, you may have some things in common with them. Maybe you look similar. You may have some similar facial characteristics, skin tone, hair type. You may have a similar accent or dialect. You may have similar quirky behaviors, idiosyncrasies. You may have similar good behaviors or maybe some bad habits. Often we have these things with our families to which we're related. And this is true of Hebrew words also. The second reason I think it's important to learn the original language and understand concepts from the scriptures in the original language is because Hebrew is an action-oriented language. English isn't an action-oriented language in the same way. See, with Hebrew, every single word is made of these three root letters that are a verb. So whether you have nouns in Hebrew, words for things, adjectives in Hebrew, words that describe something or someone, or any other kind of word, even prepositions, words that describe a relationship between one object or person in relationship to another one spatially. All of these words, they all go back to these three-letter verbal roots. So action is behind everything in the Hebrew language. It is a language that is in motion. It is very action-oriented. And when you translate from Hebrew into English, you miss much of that. It becomes more of a static instead of a dynamic language. It often becomes more of a thought pattern around things than it is around doing. So can you see the difference there? That's another reason why I believe that reading a translation gives us some problems. The third reason I think reading a translation can give us problems, especially with Hebrew, is that Hebrew is also a very concrete language. English is quite an abstract language. You have a word for something, and it's not tied to something in the physical world, something material. It's not tied to physical action or a concrete object. It is simply an idea. And it relies on your imagination and the meaning that you subjectively give it to really make that word come alive. That can be rather dangerous when you're reading the scriptures because you begin to read your own meanings into things. You begin to just make up stuff essentially. But with Hebrew, almost every word is related to a concrete object. There are some examples of this that I'm sure you have heard. For instance, the word sin. If you ask your average person on the street, what is sin to you? They'll come up with all kinds of subjective definitions and meanings. Often, though, we do that also when we are reading the word, whether it be with the word sin or anything else. But you may have heard the original Hebrew meaning for sin is a concrete verb. It simply means to miss the mark. For instance, if you are shooting an arrow or slinging a stone, if you hit the target bang on, then you haven't sinned. But if you miss the target, you miss the mark, then you have sinned. There are other examples. The Hebrew word for glory means weight or something that is heavy. So if you are a heavy person, in Hebrew you are a glorious person. What would be another example you may have heard? The Hebrew verb to make holy literally means to set apart. So to be holy in Hebrew means to be set apart. Can you see how that's a concrete action? How that is a verb? Those are some examples that you know. But here's the thing. That is all of Hebrew. All of Hebrew is like that. There are hundreds, there are thousands of instances of this. In English, though, we miss most of those. So those are three reasons that I believe it's important to familiarize ourselves as much as possible with the original language through which God revealed himself and spoke to humanity. I think this is important because this is God's word we're talking about. This is the language that he chose to originally express himself through and teach us as human beings. I think it's also important because what's the alternative? The alternative is essentially to read your translation and miss much of the original meaning because you are reading words isolated from their original families. You're reading words in English that lose much of that sense of action. You're reading words that are abstract instead of concrete. And when you do that, you begin to make stuff up. You begin to read your own interpretations into the text. And that can be rather dangerous. That's why I think this is important. And that's what Hebrew Sketches is all about. Hebrew Sketches are short talks in which I give you a Hebrew word and I give you the big idea of the word. I tell you what action words it's tied into. I show you the family of words to which this word is related. I tell you if there are any concrete objects that picture this word. That's what Hebrew Sketches is. Hebrew Sketches will be like going from watching black and white television to watching color TV. It'll be like going from maybe black light bulbs to full spectrum light bulbs. It'll be like going from two-dimensional flatland existence to three-dimensional, full-dimensional vision and interaction and motion. Seriously, that's what it's going to be like. I'll tell you a couple things about Hebrew Sketches, what you're going to encounter with these. Hebrew Sketches are going to be short because you, like most people, are probably busy. You don't have a lot of time on your hands. So I'm going to give you the big idea in a short talk. Perhaps you're familiar with the concept of writing on the back of a napkin. Let's say we're going out for coffee and I have a big idea I'm telling you about, and so I sketch it out on the back of a napkin. That's what Hebrew Talks is going to be like. That's why these are called Hebrew Sketches, big ideas on a napkin. You are literally going to be encountering my primitive stick drawings, just as if we were going out for coffee or something, and I was telling you this big idea, I was explaining it to you, and I was scribbling some pictures on a napkin for you as we went. That's something that you're going to be encountering in these Hebrew Sketches talks. Hebrew Sketches are going to be shareable. You will never have to talk about the weather or rising gas prices or some sports game that you really didn't care about ever again in conversation. You'll never have to resort to these things because you don't know what to talk about. I'll give you these big ideas, they'll be visual, and they will make you an interesting conversationalist. They're the kinds of things that you will be able to share with other people. Family members, over dinner, friends, when you go out, co-workers, during break, whatever. These are the kinds of big ideas that people will find interesting. And I'm not just talking about religious people either. Hebrew Sketches are designed to engage anybody and everybody. So if you come from a religious background, say Christian or Jewish, you will find these interesting because they'll help you to understand the Bible better. They will shed light on some concepts that maybe for you are blah, ho-hum, because you think you know it already, and suddenly you're going to learn something new, and that something new is something that you'll be able to share with other people who have been studying the Bible for years, for decades, things that they probably never knew either. But these sketches will also be interesting for non-religious people because Hebrew is a language and we all speak language. And Hebrew essentially expresses a very old view of the world, a very old way of doing life. There is a lot of old, you could even say ancient wisdom packaged in the Hebrew language. And this is the kind of thing that pretty much anyone is interested in. This is the kind of thing that pretty much everyone in our world is looking for. They're looking for practical wisdom on how to do life, helpful tips, an understanding of the world around them, of human beings, of relationships and how they work, what makes them tick, all of those kinds of things. And so Hebrew Sketches is going to be interesting for everyone, whether they're from a religious or a non-religious background. Hebrew Sketches is also going to be focused on action and change. Yes, you will get some brain candy in these talks. Yes, you will learn some new things, but it's not just going to be learning for the sake of learning. It's not just going to be information that is titillating to your mind. It's going to be so much more than that. We have this brief span of time in this beautiful world in which we can make it a better place, a more beautiful world than it already is, even for our children and people to come. And that's something that I take very seriously. That is something that I want to do. So if I'm learning anything, including Hebrew words, I want to know how it can help me to make this world a better place, how it can help me to change the world, how it can empower me on my mission, how these big ideas can be applied in my everyday life. And that's something you're going to get in these Hebrew Sketches. You're going to get an orientation around action. You're definitely going to get a bias for change. Here's something interesting about punctuation marks. Have you ever analyzed the difference between a question mark and an exclamation mark? Have you ever stopped and looked at what a question mark looks like and then what an exclamation mark looks like? Probably not. To me, question marks look like little hooks. And have you ever noticed that is essentially what a question does? When you ask someone a question, what does it do? It hooks them, so to speak. It engages them in the conversation. It hooks something inside of them and draws out their thoughts, their understanding, or the way they see things. That's what question marks do. Exclamation marks, on the other hand, which generally come at the end of a sentence where you're telling something to someone, look more like a little clubs or little baseball bats. And what is your first response if I come at you with a baseball bat or I come at you with a club of some kind? That's probably your first response. Hands go up, you go into a defensive posture, and then you either resort to fight or flight. You're either going to attack me in response, or you are going to take off and run. And that is often people's response when you come at them with exclamation marks, when you just start telling them things. Inside, this is what happens. The defenses go up, and then they generally will either disengage and try and sneak away from you, whether you're aware of it or not, maybe excuse themselves in a polite fashion, or they lean in and fight back. And not in the sense of being persuaded about anything, not in the sense of being open to you and your ideas, in the sense of an argument. That's generally what happens. So, Hebrew Sketches is not going to be so much about exclamation marks as it's going to be about question marks. I'm going to give you more questions than answers. Yes, I'll share some of my thoughts with you. I will tell you what I think about some of these big ideas, but I'm also going to give you a lot of questions, hopefully to get you thinking, and hopefully, if you are doing these talks not just by yourself, but with a couple other people, to get you talking with each other, to get you brainstorming together, and get those things that you already know, that you may not even be aware of that you know. Get them coming out of you, being drawn out of you. So that's essentially what you're going to be encountering in Hebrew sketches. This is the flavor that we're going to have for these. Before I wrap up this little introduction, I'd also like to explain to you for another couple minutes how words are related to each other in Hebrew. This is rather technical, actually. This is something that comes from the field of linguistics, the study of languages. Words aren't just related to each other any old way. You don't just get to make up subjectively the relationship that you think exists there. You can't just say, well, I think this word and that word are related to each other, and therefore their meanings are related, and I just made something up that sounds really smart, and now I'm going to tell people this new understanding that I just made up. That's not how it happens. There are some very clearly defined rules that help us to understand how words are related to each other. And these rules are widely understood and commonly accepted in the field of linguistics, and not only for Hebrew, but basically for any language. So something to understand about Hebrew that I already explained in brief is that every Hebrew word is comprised of 3 root letters. The Hebrew word for root is shoresh. So we call those 3 root letters the shoresh of the word. Those 3 root letters are always a verb, an action word. So whether the Hebrew word is a noun, an adjective, an adverb, a preposition, or whatever, they're made from these 3 root letters that are an action word, a verb. I'm trying to think of an example in English that I could give you. It's hard because they're 2 different languages in terms of how they're structured, but just as a rough example, let's say we had the 3 root letters G, L, D in English. G, L, D, that's the shoresh, the root. What words in English come from that 3-letter root? Well, you have glad, which is an adjective. You have gladden, which is a verb. You have gladness, which is a noun, and you have gladly, which is an adverb. So can you see how even in English we have something slightly similar? You have these root letters, you have the root word, and then it takes different forms depending on how it's used in the sentence, its grammatical function. That's the way it is with Hebrew also, only so much more so, and it's very consistent. So if you're learning Hebrew, this should make you very glad, actually. Because if you aren't sure what a word means, all you need to do is identify the 3-letter root, the shoresh, and then look up those 3 letters in a Hebrew dictionary. And once you learn those 3 letters, that 3-letter shoresh root, then you will be able to understand a whole bunch of words. Nouns, adjectives, adverbs, as I'd mentioned, all these different types of words. You'll be able to understand them because you understand the 3-letter root from which they are all comprised. So, isn't that a relief for you? Sometimes when Christians begin learning about Israel, about the Torah, and its relevancy to the life of the believer, learning about the Jewishness of Jesus and the New Testament, they say they're learning about their Hebrew roots. So, talking about the 3-letter Hebrew roots of words, you could say this is Hebrew Roots 101, literally. So if you're one of those believers who are into their Hebrew roots, you will be all over these Hebrew Sketches talks because these are like Hebrew roots. There is a fancy term, a technical term for related words. We say they are cognates or cognate. You can use that term as either a noun or an adjective. So if you say this word and that word are cognates, then you're using the word as a noun. You can also say this word and that word are cognate, and you're using it as an adjective, a describing word. So that's the word that you may encounter in the field of linguistics and also sometimes in these sketches when I talk about words being cognate. Cognate comes from the Latin word cognatus, which means a blood relative, which is exactly essentially what it means in English also when we talk about words, except they're not related by blood. They are related, however, in one of 2 ways. And this is how you're going to see how words are related in Hebrew, also in these Hebrew sketches. They're either related by having similar sounds or having similar spellings. just to simplify that for you. So when Hebrew words have similar sounds, each of their 3 sounds come from the same area of the mouth. For instance, let's think of the Hebrew roots samach and tzamach. Samach means to rejoice. Tzamach means to grow. Can you hear how the first sound in these 2 words, s and ts, come from the same part of your mouth? And then the other 2 sounds, m and ch, are identical. So that would be an example of 2 words that are cognate, that are related to each other through similar sounds. Now, the study of this relationship, it's a linguistic science. It has clearly defined rules. The fancy linguistic term for these similar sounds is homoorganic consonants. In this term, homo means same, and organic means organ or body part. So these are sounds which come from the same organ or body part, s or ts, for instance. In Hebrew, we describe these similar sounds as motzehem mimakom echad. Literally, they are sounds which go out from the same place. So s and ts are both coming from the same place, the same part of my mouth. There are 5 homoorganic consonantal families that every Hebrew sound belongs to. So anything you say in Hebrew is comprised of sounds, and every one of those sounds belong to one of 5 families. As you know, Hebrew has 22 letters, so I'll just tell you these 5 families, and then I'll tell you which letters, representing sounds in the Hebrew language, they belong to. The first family is the gutturals. Gutturals are sounds you make in the back of your throat. Guttural comes from the Latin word for throat. The letters that belong to this family are aleph, hey, chet, and ayin. The second family is the palatal family. Palatals are sounds you make with your tongue and the roof of your mouth, your palate. The letters that belong to the palatal family are gimel, yod, kaf, and kuf. The third family that Hebrew sounds can belong to is the dental family. Dentals are sounds you make with your tongue and top teeth, or dentals. The letters that belong to this family, representing sounds, are dalet, tet, lamed, nun, and tav. The fourth family that sounds in the Hebrew language belong to is the labial family. Labials are sounds you make with your lips. Labial comes from the Latin word for lip, which is labium. The sounds that belong to the labial family in Hebrew are vet, vav, mem, and pe, fe. And then the fifth family that Hebrew sounds can belong to is the sibilant family. Sibilants are sounds you make by forcing air through your mouth. Sibilant is from the Latin word sibilare, to hiss. The sounds that belong to this family are zayin, samech, tzadi, resh, shin, and sin. So that's the first relationship that Hebrew words can have with each other. They have similar sounds, homoorganic consonants, motzehem mimikom echad. So when I talk about words being cognate, I will usually be talking about them having similar sounds. The second relationship that Hebrew words can have to each other when we are determining which family they belong to is similar spelling. Basically, if 2 Hebrew words have root letters that are spelled almost the same except for one of them is changed or varied, then we say they have a variant relationship. So again, there are clearly defined rules for this relationship too. It doesn't just work to replace any letter with any other letter you want, but I'm not going to go into all the details of how you identify which letters are interchangeable But just suffice to say for now that you don't get to just make it up. You don't just get to take a Hebrew root and pop one letter out and pop in another letter and say, oh look, these two words are related to each other, therefore their meanings are related, and I'm going to make a new theology. It doesn't work that way. Again, there are clearly defined rules, and it's a little too complex to go into right now because this is just an introduction. This is supposed to have the feel of something being sketched out for you on a napkin. But hopefully that'll just give you a rough overview of how Hebrew words are related to each other, how we know which family they belong to. And you know, there are so many examples that I could give you for every single one of these things I've said. I had mentioned how there are these two Hebrew roots, samach and samach, to rejoice and to grow, and how they're related because they have similar sounds. I could give you dozens, I could give you hundreds of fascinating examples, but I'm not going to do that in this intro because that's what Hebrew Sketches is all about. So let's just go straight to our first Hebrew sketch talk and start to encounter some examples firsthand.